All right, it's just a little bit after 10 o'clock, so we will go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone to day number 4 of our virtual Tillamook County Children's Clean Water Festival. Thank you all for joining us. Just a quick reminder that you will not have video or microphone during this presentation. Only the panelists will have that option. But if you have any questions, you can send them to us in the chat. We will also have a Q&A session at the end of the program where I'll be asking your questions to Aaron and he'll be answering what you've sent us. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded and it will be available on the Children's Clean Water Festival webpage at www.tbnep.org soon, maybe later today, but more likely tomorrow. And don't forget to check out that website. You'll be able to access our online exhibit hall with videos and activities from our partners, as well as the recordings from the last 3 Clean Water Festival webinars that we've had so far and next week's webinars. So I'm gonna stop sharing real quick. And I want to say welcome to Aaron Campbell, who's joining us today from the Jackson Bottom Wetlands Preserve over in the Hillsborough area. And he's gonna give a presentation today called Incredible Journey, or we're gonna share a video today called Incredible Journey. And so welcome, Aaron.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Aaron is a nature educator at the Jackson Bottom Wetlands Preserve. So today we'll be working on the Incredible Journey section of the packets, packet number 2, that you should have gotten this week from your teachers or that you can download from our website online underneath the presentations for Incredible Journey or Wetland Wonders. There was a pre-activity in this packet to create a water cycle wheel that involved coloring and cutting out the wheel and putting it together with a little metal brad. If you haven't done that yet, you can do it while we watch the video to learn more about the water cycle. And you also received a plastic bag in your packets, or you have one ready to go today. So that, along with your markers, you can use to complete the activity that we're going to show you in this video. So I'm going to go ahead. Aaron, do you have anything you want to say before we get started?
Well, if you are ever interested, Jackson Bottom Wetlands is doing exploration days every Sunday until June. So every Sunday, noon to 2, if you guys are in the Hillsborough area, come out to Jackson Bottom, and we're doing free COVID-safe activities for kids and families. And it's really fun to learn about fungus or scat or the water cycle. There's all kinds of things to learn out there. Highly recommend you guys join us.
Great, thank you, Aaron. And I did just put a link to the Jackson Bottom Wetlands website over in our chat bar. So you can go to that link to learn more about the wetlands and the education programs that they have there. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and share a video with everyone that's gonna introduce us to Jackson Bottom Wetlands and the incredible journey of the water cycle. So feel free to send us your questions in the chat as you're watching. And once the video is over, we'll have a Q&A session with Aaron to answer any of those questions that you might have. All right.
Planet. Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Campbell. I'm a nature educator here at Jackson Bottom Wetlands Preserve in Hillsborough, Oregon. Today we're talking about the water cycle. As you can see, it's raining on me a little bit and the wetlands here is flooded. Now, how did all this water get here? It's through the water cycle that we receive all this water. So what is the water cycle? Well, it is the process in which water is recycled on this planet. And there's 4 main processes that occur. We have evaporation, which is where sun or heat will turn the water in a pond like this into gas or vapor and it'll rise into the atmosphere. And then we have condensation. Condensation forms in clouds or fog. And then when that condensation becomes too much, it'll pour down as rain, sleet, or snow in precipitation. Now, once that rain starts to gather on the ground or mountains or glaciers, it's called accumulation. So those four processes help cycle the water on our planet. Now, why is this important? Here at Jackson Bottom Wetlands, we are at floodplain. So anytime the Tualatin River that runs through the valley floods, we receive a lot of its floodwater. So the water cycle is important because it gives us fresh, clean drinking water to utilize. Now, the Tualatin River stops at many towns and farms along its way, and those farms and towns require clean drinking water to use. So a wetlands like this is very important for cleaning that water. Now, the water cycle recycles the water, but also toxins. So when the water comes into a wetlands here, our soils act like a sponge, and that sponge soaks up the water and releases it over time. But as it releases it, it filters through all the sand, silt, and clay that we have in our soil here. And that filtration ends up cleaning the water so it can move downstream and be utilized. Now, today we are going to do some activities that show you how the water cycle works. So let's go inside and see some of the activities we can do at home.
So everyone should have made a water cycle wheel before watching the video here. And this is a great craft idea that helps you see how the water cycle occurs. It shows the four main processes and gives you a nice artistic vision into how the water cycle works. But our activity that we want to show you guys is something that you can see the water cycle happen in action. Now, this activity we have for you guys is called the water cycle bag. And this is a great representation of the water cycle that you can see in action within your own home. Now, it only requires a few household items. You have a plastic bag here, either a gallon bag or even a smaller sandwich bag works just as well. And we need a Sharpie or a marker to draw the water cycle on the bag so you can see how the water circulates. Now, you also need some sort of heat source. Now, this can be the sun or, like we've used, a desk lamp because it's pretty cloudy and rainy today. So, as long as you have that heat source shining on the bag, the water cycle will begin. So, like we talked about outside, it first starts with evaporation. As the water begins to heat, it'll turn into a gas and vapor and slowly move up into the atmosphere. Now, as it slowly gathers in the atmosphere, it condenses, and that will condense into clouds. So, condensation, as you can see, kind of hard to see, but it's very slowly happening at the top here. Condensation can form all different kinds of clouds, even fog. So condensation is really important because as the water condenses and gets too heavy, then it falls back to the floor as precipitation. So precipitation can come in many different forms depending on the ambient temperatures, either in the sky or on the ground. So if both the sky and ground are warm, it'll fall as rain. If the sky is cold, but the air is warm, it could potentially fall as freezing rain or hail. And if both are cold, it can then fall as snow. So as it falls, depending on what it falls as, is going to determine where it ends up in the water cycle here. So accumulation is when water gathers. Now this can gather in areas called watersheds where water collects. And watersheds are fed by surface flow or also end up feeding aquifers. Now these three main parts are very important for the water cycle here and for human use of fresh water, because we get most of our water from watersheds. Now, watersheds are filled by the precipitation and accumulation of the water within the land here. So as snow falls on the very tippy tops of the mountains, the snow can then gather into ice and form glaciers, or can potentially produce snow melt or snow runoff. And so the snow melt will then turn into water as the water runs down the surface of the mountains. And that surface flow will collect in the form of streams, rivers, ponds, or lakes. Now, eventually, that water will make it back out to the ocean. But what happens if all that snow accumulates into ice? It'll then form what we call glaciers. And glaciers can actually keep water for millions and millions of years. So not all of the water gets recycled immediately. Now, what's really cool is your guys' little crumpled paper watersheds give you a great example of how water accumulates. So snow is very sticky and sticks to itself. So it'll accumulate very easily on top of itself, where water is extremely viscous, and it'll run down the surface very easily. So what you've seen from your watersheds, water can really easily run down the mountain slopes and gather into gulches, canyons, or valleys. And that water eventually will run back into the ocean or get absorbed by the ground and become groundwater. So there's a lot of different ways that the water cycle can benefit us, and there's a lot of different ways that water can be recycled on this planet as well. It's a really cool thing, and this water bag activity gives you a great example of how that happens. So earlier, we brushed on how the water cycle is important for human use, through farming, plumbing, drinking, etc. But is it important for plants and animals as well? Absolutely. So animals get their water through drinking or through eating their food. Oftentimes, some animals can get enough water that they need through their food source. Now, plants also need plenty of water. Now, cactus in the desert will store water in their giant trunks. And trees here in the Pacific Northwest will also store water. Now, as the rain falls and accumulates on the ground will actually absorb a lot of that water. And that groundwater will then get absorbed by the plant roots here. And the plant roots will then send that water up through the tree and hydrate the plant. Now, when the plant is done with that water, it sweats it out through a process called evapotranspiration. And that is when you can see little tiny water droplets on blades of grass or the leaves, and that water eventually ends back into the water cycle, either falling back to the ground or getting evaporated into the atmosphere. The Amazon rainforest is a great example of that. That rainforest has so much water within its trees that it actually creates most of its own weather through evapotranspiration. So when animals drink water, they drink water to hydrate. And when their body has recycled and done with that water, what do you think happens to it? They pee it out. Urination. So animal pee, is also part of the water cycle. It eventually ends up as groundwater or gets evaporated back in the atmosphere, just like the water from plants. So one great example here at the wetlands is the rough-skinned newt. You may have seen these guys around your home, but they are a brown-backed amphibian with a bright orange belly that lets people know, stay back, I'm poisonous. Now, this animal relies on moisture. Since they are an amphibian, they need moisture to help them breathe through their skin. So during the winter time, like right now, they are actually migrating to find the most moisture. So some of them, including newts, other newts, salamanders, and frogs, will actually migrate from ponds to land or land to pond, depending on the type of year. So moisture is extremely important for them, for their survival. Now, other salamanders will actually dig where the dirt is moist, and they'll actually live underground through some of the winter months. So having the water cycle in place is extremely important for not only drinking, but breathing and other life. So by this example and others, you can see that the water cycle is extremely important for all life functions. Now, how do you think the water cycle might be changing? Now, all around you, you've probably seen news reports of climate change, or even evidence of climate change in your own neighborhood. But right now, our water cycle is changing dramatically. So as our planet warms, our polar ice caps, which are the engines of our jet streams and ocean currents, which power our weather, are melting. And as they melt, they lose a lot of that power. So our jet streams are starting to slow, and our ocean currents are starting to slow or even change direction. And that is changing the weather in which we see. So the weather is a huge part of our water cycle. In the Pacific Northwest, we are usually pretty rainy and mild temperatures, and that's how you see all the green around you on the hillsides. But as our jet streams slow, we're starting to see longer summers, hotter summers, and less precipitation over time. So our accumulation levels and our precipitation levels may change in the future as our poles and the rest of our world changes. So it's important to note how important the water cycle is to us in its state and where it potentially could be in the future. And as humans and as the rest of the planet, plants, animals, we all are going to have to adapt to those changes.
All right. That was an excellent video from Aaron at Jackson Bottom Wetlands Preserve. I'm going to share my screen one more time for a different slide. But this one, because we already saw that one. So we're going to open it up now for questions. And I know we got one that was really interesting that we'd love to hear answered.
I can elaborate a little bit more on that one.
Yeah.
So even our own water system, when we flush a toilet, it goes back into a sewage or water treatment plant. And that water actually gets cleaned and recycled and sent back out into our water system. So by definition, yes, we are drinking pee. But
so the question was
first.
Yeah. So the question was, do we drink animal pee? And Aaron's answer was that it's part of the water cycle, but the water that we're drinking has been cleaned at a water treatment plant, and therefore is free of any of those particles that might be coming from the land or anything like that, or any animals that might be also in the water.
And this is why wetlands are really important as well, because they do the exact same process as a water treatment plant. They clean all the water for usage down the road.
That's very correct. All right. Do we have any other questions that we want to ask Aaron here? You can go ahead, and we have a much smaller crowd today, I think, because a lot of the schools are not in school today. So if you have any questions, you can send them over in the chat, and Aaron and I will answer them. I think everybody's working on their water cycle bags right now.
Yeah. Well, I have a question for everyone if they're interested. Yeah. I didn't mention it in the video. Oh, that's a great question. Let me answer that one first. So the water cycle, like I was saying, can take anywhere from a month to a couple million years. It depends on where that water ends up in the cycle. A lot of glaciers have stored ice for millions and millions of years. So another cool part about the water you're drinking is that it could be very, very old. So the water cycle takes a long, long time, often to process. Good question.
That was a great question. Does the squirrel have anything to do with the water system?
It does. It does. So a lot of squirrels will eat nuts. They'll eat seeds, plants. So all their food requires water. They themselves require water. So any organism that requires water is going to be part of the water cycle. So like we were talking about animal pee, squirrels have to pee too. So their urine will eventually go either into the ground or get evaporated into the atmosphere and once again get cycled in with the rest of the water.
And Aaron, you had a question for all of us.
So I didn't mention it in the video. I had forgot to mention it, but the water cycle is really important because we only have a limited amount of fresh water on our planet. Can anyone guess the percentage of fresh water on our planet? Out of the 100% of all the water, how much is fresh? Does anyone know? Or just have a guess?
We'll give you all a second to come up with some answers and put them into the chat if you know or have a guess of what percentage of the Earth's water cycle is fresh water.
Now, the last question, does the quality of water affect the water cycle? In a way, it can, but more or less evaporation is, I guess it depends. So the quality of the water is not necessarily going to affect the water cycle, but it will affect the animals and plants that use it. So oftentimes if water is too polluted, you're not going to have the animals or plants that you normally would have to either help clean it or utilize it. So it may start a different process within the water cycle, but it shouldn't change it all too much. However, I will mention, so some we have 70%, 4 to 5%. All right, you guys are getting close. Now, the other thing I did want to mention is that polluted snow can definitely affect the water cycle. So polluted water itself, water can be evaporated and while the chemicals and other pollutants get left behind. But snow is interesting because snow is white, and say like a wildfire, if a wildfire happens and ash covers that layer of snow, it'll change the color of it. And by changing the color, that will affect the rate at which it melts. So a darker color will absorb more heat from the sun. So usually darker snow patches that have like soot or pollution on top can actually melt faster. So that will affect the water cycle. But dams, that's a great question as well. So dams do affect the water cycle. They affect the natural flow of the rivers because we block up the river and use the water as we need for electricity. But a big issue is that they don't all block up water, they block up sediment and debris, which also creates habitat downstream for fish. And as that water and debris gets piled up, it starts to go bad, like get rotten. And so dams are actually causing a lot of pollution because of all the debris and everything that they're backing up. So it's all rotting underneath that dam there, and all those gases are being extruded through that water system there. So if a river can't function normally, then that will definitely have an effect on the water cycle within that environment, but also will affect the atmosphere too within that environment. Ooh, so I see some good guesses on the percentage. So you guys are actually really close. I see a 2% and a 4 and 5, and you guys are right around it. So 3% of the world's water is fresh, and 2% of that is actually in ice. So we only have 1% of the entire world's water to use. So it's really important to keep the water cycle functioning and to keep our water as clean as possible. Excellent job, you guys. Beaver dams, that's a great question. So our human dams are made of cement and they don't allow water through unless we let it. Beaver dams are made of mud, sticks, and grass, and they actually will eventually let water through in some areas. They're not completely watertight. So that's a good reason. So beaver dams aren't very tall. Oftentimes they can be maybe 5 to 10 feet tall at the most. And what that'll do is that actually slows the stream or the river, and it'll actually spread out that water. So what's really cool is it allows beavers to find more sources of food, but it'll also spread more water to plants and other parts of the ecosystem. So especially with flooding, if we get winter floods and the water rushes down a stream, oftentimes without beaver dams, it'll take a lot of sediment and dig these large ditches or gulches, and that'll actually ruin an ecosystem. In Colorado, parts of Colorado, beavers were hunted to extinction. So a lot of creek beds are 20 to 30 feet deep because there's no more beaver dams there to help slow that floodwater. So beaver dams are actually really important for a lot of ecosystems. Great question.
All right, do we have any more questions for Aaron here before we go? Takes a second to type them. There we go. Oh, here's a good question. Are COVID masks and gloves affecting the quality of our water?
That is a great question. Well, yes. Sadly, a lot of gloves and plastic or masks are made of plastic. And oftentimes those plastic are made of tiny little fibers. And these fibers will eventually get loose into the water system. So that is a pollutant that oftentimes we have trouble screening for or stopping. So plastic, we call it microplastics. It's a huge issue on our oceans, and it's becoming a larger and larger problem in our freshwater systems as well, especially as more and more masks and gloves are just tossed out onto the ground. So the other issue is that COVID can transfer through our feces, through our poop and our urine. So a lot of wastewater now is also containing COVID. So that is becoming an issue that treatment plants are having to adapt to. Now, a lot of treatment plants use UV light to clean their water systems, and that will actually kill a lot of things, most bacteria and viruses. So we shouldn't worry too much, but over time, if it becomes a reoccurring issue, it can affect our quality of water for sure.
We had two really great questions here.
That is a good question. So here's the thing. So you can make a patch of ice artificially, but to be a glacier, it has to be a certain size. So to be a glacier, it has to be, I'm not entirely sure of the size, but it has to be really, really big, like almost like a square mile in diameter. So it's really big. It has to be very large and pretty deep to be considered a glacier. So to make that artificially, we would have to have a massive freezer, or during winter, maybe add to it consistently, and over time we might be able to build up enough snow. But the issue is our winters are warming. So even if we can make man-made glaciers, the ambient temperature outside may end up melting those pretty quickly. So it's a great question. I don't think it's going to be very feasible though.
Mm-hmm. And then the last question we'll have here is, what happens when we do not get heavy snowfall in the year?
That's a great question. So think about yourself, where do most of our water come from? It comes from snowmelt, especially here in the Portland area in the coastal range. The coastal range this winter got quite a bit of snow, and there's definitely still some snow in areas. So that snow, as it melts, will refill our streams and rivers. So a lot of our drinking water comes from snow. So the less snowpack that we have every year, the less water we're going to have throughout the summer. So that can be a huge issue. As we grow in human population, our water needs grow as well. So we need more water. But if there's less and less snowpack every year, we're going to have less and less water to hand out. So it's really important to have a big snowpack. All right.
All right, one last question of yesterday we learned about macroinvertebrates, and are they connected to the water cycle?
Yes, absolutely. So macroinvertebrates, a lot of them are actually the insects you see flying around in the summertime. So macroinvertebrates are not only important for the water cycle, but they're important for everything. So macroinvertebrates are great at representing water quality. So like we said earlier, water quality can have an effect on the water cycle. And if an area of water is low quality, you're usually going to see maybe 1 to 3 species of macroinvertebrates. But if you look at a piece of or a body of water and you see a ton of different macroinvertebrates, lots of different species, you know that the quality of water is actually going to be much greater. The higher quality of water, the more nutrients there are for these microinvertebrates. And what we like to call DO, that's dissolved oxygen. So that's the oxygen in water that the organisms breathe. So a lot of the macroinvertebrates that maybe you guys got to look at yesterday have little fan tails on the sides. Those are their gills. So they actually use those to grab the oxygen. And the lower quality of water, the less oxygen there's going to be for these animals to breathe. So it is important. Water that's highly oxygenated is really easy to evaporate and all these other things. So it's really important for the water cycle and the environment in general. So yeah, macroinvertebrates are really important. They're also a great food source for a lot of other animals. So they're connected via the food web, the water cycle, all that.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to end our webinar here since we're a little after 10:30. We will be back live again next Tuesday with Jocelyn from the Tillamook Forest Center. We're going to be learning about some responsible recreation and leave no trace. And then our last day of Clean Water Festival next Wednesday. As far as the live sessions go, we'll be welcoming Julia from the Columbia River Maritime Museum for a presentation on marine debris. So thank you everyone for joining us again. Thank you, Aaron, so much for joining us today, for answering our excellent questions.
Yeah, of course.
And for the wonderful video. And do, folks, if you get a chance, make sure to get out sometime to Jackson Bottom Wetlands Preserve and see some of their programming. Aaron, I forgot to tell you that when I end the webinar, we'll all get kicked off. So
Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, of course.
And everyone, remember to check out the online exhibit hall and our recordings from the previous presentations. All right.
Thanks guys.
All.
Yep. Have a great day.